Hey everyone, my name is Dr. Dolores Tarver. I'm a licensed psychologist here in Georgia, and it is time for the TT Time with Dr. Tarver is a wellness-based podcast. It is not intended to be a substitute for a relationship with a licensed mental health provider. Second week of July already, and it is Minority Mental Health Awareness Month, and we are going to be focusing this month on people of color, Black, Indigenous, and we are trying to focus a little bit this month on some of the topics I wanted to cover last month as well. So, last week we got into the effects of feeling rejection and how that is particularly applicable to people of color. And I wanted to also make sure I got some discussion in there about LGBTQ plus IA populations in honor of Pride Month last month. This week, I really want to get into a topic that I think is becoming more and more prevalent, particularly with the high rates of incarceration of people of color. And so this episode is entitled Beyond the Bars: The Effects of Parental Incarceration on Families. You probably at some point in your life have known someone who was incarcerated or known someone who had a parent that was incarcerated. How do I know that to be true? Because according to the American Psychological Association, upwards of about 2.7 million children have at least one parent behind bars, and at least 5 million have experienced parental incarceration at some point in their lives. To put that into context a little bit, according to the Economic Policy Institute, that's about 1 in 10 African American students who have an incarcerated parent. So, how is this affecting our young people? How is this affecting the incarcerated parent? I think that there's just so much stigma that is associated with incarceration. And whereas we recognize that people of color are incarcerated at higher rates, particularly relative to where we fall in the population of the country, I think that there is still this perception that people are bad and they're mean and they're awful and they don't need to have access to their children, instead of recognizing some of the reasons why people were incarcerated, which often are nonviolent. And then, even as we go a little deeper, how many of those people received sentences that were considered very extensive given the type of crime they committed. And we also are aware that partners of people who were convicted of charges, particularly women, are often incarcerated at higher rates, Black women in particular. And so, regardless of how people end up being incarcerated, we do know, according to the National Resource Center on Children and Families of Incarcerated, that our young people are going to experience some negative consequences. We're also very aware that incarcerated parents often experience a variety of things, such as mental health challenges. There may be substance abuse use, inadequate education. There may be people who have been incarcerated who are children of parents who were incarcerated. And so what we realize is there is just a kind of systemic barrier with regard to some of the challenges that allow people to have access or end up in our juvenile justice as well as penal institutions. And there is a misperception, I do think, that children of incarcerated parents are much more likely to be incarcerated. However, there is a predisposition because of adverse childhood experiences, which we recognize that having a parent who has been incarcerated is an adverse child experience. You've heard that terminology, ACE. Because of the combination of trauma and shame and stigma that is wrapped up in there, that we do have young people who are at higher risk for depression, aggressive and antisocial behavior, delinquency, poverty, um, lack of adequate educational resources, and also who may not have stable living environments, because oftentimes when that parent who goes to jail is not available, then who is left to take care of the children? They may end up in foster care or with relatives or friends of relatives that could bounce around a good bit. And we also do know that our young people have higher instances of being suspended or expelled from school. Their physical health tends to be worse, and they are likely in positions where they may have food insecurity because of being in environments where they don't have that stability because they have a parent who's incarcerated. It is, in fact, such a challenge that in 2013, Sesame Street actually created a character, introduced a character named Alex. And Alex was the first Muppet to have a father in jail. And we'll talk a little bit about, toward the end, some resources in Sesame Street actually is a resource as well to be able to talk with our young people about when their parents are incarcerated. So I want to break it down a little bit more. We talked about the detriments to particularly to children, but I also want to talk about women and men who are incarcerated. And in women, you've heard multiple times that women are considered kind of triple minority when they're black women, because being black is a minority, being a woman. As a minority. And then also just kind of you talk about the intersection of race and class and gender, and women just being invisible. And so mothers who are incarcerated particularly are seen as less than, not valuing their children, being deplorable, not should not be able to have access to their children again, when the reality is oftentimes women who go into the penal system who have children were the primary caregivers of their children and want to resume being the primary caregivers of their children when they get out. And so, but what we have seen since around 1980, according to the Sentencing Project, is that the number of incarcerated women has outpaced the rate of men by 50%, making them the fastest growing segment of the nation's prison population. And I know you all are thinking, well, this is making bad choices. However, it is often not the case. If you look at, again, nonviolent offenses for which a lot of women are incarcerated, and in service, honestly, trying to figure out how to take care of their children and end up making some mistakes along the way or getting involved with people who are involved in criminal activity, and then the women are incarcerated as a result of their partners being involved in criminal activity. And so I think it's important for us to stop stigmatizing women and looking them in negative and that they don't care about their children. Because again, the majority of mothers want to be caregivers for their kids again when they are released. So but let's kind of talk about some of the things that do affect particularly black women who have been incarcerated because of those intersectional identities. As a black woman, there is a lot of oppression that black women experience in that penal system. And unfortunately, that includes sexual assault and abuse, verbal abuse and aggression, demeaning, dehumanizing types of behavior. And again, just this standard of comparison to women of other ethnicities of being the bottom of the heap, if you will, being the worst of the worst. And then on top of that, we have things such as Georgia's convict lease contract. So I think the first time Georgia engaged in a convict lease contract was around 1868. And literally, what you're doing is you are leasing out prisoners, hundreds of prisoners, to work for not even minimum wage. Oftentimes, not even being compensated, just to be able to have free labor to address a labor crisis. $2,500 was given to the state for these prisoners. 2,500. So you even think about the minimal value that was placed on these people's lives. And formerly incarcerated mothers, as they come out, because of their criminal histories and because of how they're labeled, you're unfit, you're a deviant. you don't deserve to have your children, it can be very difficult for them to reestablish custody of their children and to be able to be in positions where they can economically provide for their children. And we have women again talking about some of the factors how women end up being incarcerated when there is a history of victimization, sexual victimization, oftentimes poverty themselves that women were in, substance abuse, and prior involvement with the criminal justice system, of course, puts people at higher risk to reoffend because, again, women are trying to figure out how are we going to be able to get in a position where I can take care of you if no one will hire me, won't give me opportunities. And a lot of times, women have expressed the difficulty of once they are released, but you are still on supervised kind of from probation officers. Or you're out on parole officers. And so you are trying to manage all of the requirements that they have, which often can interfere with you being able to have a job. Because if you're called and said that you need to show up for a random drug screen, if you don't show up for that drug screen, you go back to jail. So what do you tell your employer that, like, oh, I have to go and leave for a drug screen in the middle of this shift? Oftentimes people are going to have difficulty being able to have people be open to them having that type of flexibility to be able to go and take care of those things. And then, of course, that financial requirement of child support for a lot of people can make it very prohibitive as well for them to be able to get their children because they haven't been able to satisfy that financial requirement or be able to establish themselves as capable of being able to take care of their children once they are re entering the community after they've been incarcerated. And a lot of mothers express guilt about decisions that they've made, and don't think that because people make that bad decisions, that's what they want for their children. They want better for their children. And oftentimes, and I think all of us can relate to this piece, sometimes you think of something as a short term, like, hey, in the short term, I can do this to get to a long term gain. But sometimes we haven't thought through all of the consequences of that short term. And so inevitably we end up making decisions that cost us more in the long term. And that's that empathy piece that I think is very important for us as we're thinking about women who have been involved in the criminal justice system, that there was a life before they became incarcerated. And there can be a life for them after they're incarcerated. But they have to be able to have the same kind of opportunities to provide, just like anybody needs to be able to provide for their children. And again, we talk about potential lack of support, lack of education. Already, we know there's some economic insecurity, health challenges. The care in prisons and jails is not ideal. Oftentimes, inmates do not have the opportunity to get adequate care they need, and so you can come out with a lot of significant health issues. And so now I have health issues, but I still need to be able to work. And oftentimes women will sacrifice their own health to ensure their children are taken care of. So then you have women who are trying to work in subpar, inhumane conditions without adequate pay because that's bringing in some kind of revenue, it's generating something. Or in that potential again, which may have led them to be incarcerated in the first place, and looking for that financial security that a partner could potentially offer, not recognizing the partner's criminal activities, or recognizing them to a certain extent, but not being involved in them and figuring, okay, well, at least I can be able to provide for my children because I'm pretty dependent at this point, given some of the other factors that might be at play with regard to me being able to have access to things that would have allowed me to be able to take care of my children. If you talk about not graduating from high school, that's a risk factor. You talk about getting pregnant in your teen years, that's a risk factor. You talk about coming from an abusive home environment, that's a risk factor. You talk about being in communities where there is a lot of crime, that's a factor, right? And so we're talking about being able to manage all of these barriers to being able to take care of your kids effectively, being able to take care of yourself effectively as a woman. And it's easy to see how women can end up in situations where they're incarcerated and then you have to spend so much time trying to get people to see past that. And it can be a hopeless and very challenging and helpless feeling, to be able to try to get people to see that you have the potential past some of the mistakes that you've made in your life. So let's talk about our brothers. So, according to the Florida Atlantic University's College of Social Work and Criminal Justice, more than 1.1 million African American men are in prison in the United States, and about half of them are fathers. So about 500,000 of those men are fathers. I want you to sit for a minute about 1.1 million African American men being incarcerated. And we do know that there are wrongful convictions. So not everyone who is incarcerated actually committed the crime for which they are convicted. But I think for us, when someone is in jail, again, we think you deserve it. You need to be punished. You're an animal. And unfortunately, that is some of the ways that our incarcerated men are treated. They are demeaned. Um, they are not treated as if they're human. They are not given adequate opportunities to rest and have clean facilities to shower in. We've heard a lot just in here in Georgia about some of the challenges with mold and leaking running water and not being even able to have access to warm water. And that what is served, that is stated it's food. I've heard stories of people being denied medical services and being told to stop coming to the sick bay to get any services, as if people are a nuisance and they are malingering or trying to get sympathy, when in fact they're dealing with significant issues, some of which can lead to more chronic issues long term because they weren't treated properly. Um, Men have shared that prior to them being released and after they were released, that a lot of them have so many barriers to being able to rehabilitate, because unfortunately they themselves may have had a parent who was incarcerated, particularly a father who was incarcerated, or perhaps at the time of their arrest they were at a position where their children were so very young, they don't even have any kind of connection with their children, particularly when they serve longer sentences, or because of their age, when they went in, they might have been a juvenile offender, but then were incarcerated for several years, sometimes decades. And so when you come out, the world has changed so much, and you don't necessarily have any skills that would can be considered usable skills. And of course, it doesn't look like you've had any work experience. And so, who is going to hire you? And particularly given that you've been incarcerated, your options already are limited with regard to people that will hire people that have a criminal record. They talk about how intimidating and frustrating and frightening it is trying to re enter their communities, and how high those recidivism rates are as a result of that. You try to get an opportunity to be able to take care of your family, to be able to pay your child support. That is definitely a prohibitive factor. And as we know, that can be a reason why men are incarcerated again, is because of their failure to be able to pay their child support because they're in arrears. But then I cannot pay any child support if I'm incarcerated. And so, even though I may not be paying all of what is owed to my child, which doesn't mean I don't want to pay it, but I'm maybe not in a position to pay for it, given the wages that I'm able to secure with my background. I'm giving something toward it, but again, you get to a certain point where you're not able to catch up with that arrears, and so then you're incarcerated. And now we know, particularly here in Georgia, the ability for people to get paroled may be limited by organizations that are trying to support and help, because now you're limited to only being able to get three people out on parole. Um, and so I think it's very important for us to really understand that men also who had incarcerated fathers may struggle to identify with being caregivers for their own children, being able to connect to them, being able to connect to a support system and know what that looks like, because maybe that's not anything that they were able to have access to. They've got their own issues of abandonment that they're dealing with, as well as mental health, substance abuse, things that are in there. Coming out of that poverty environment, it really is a challenge for people trying to get out of poverty. And then I think so. I think for fathers, there is another unique challenge of that the mothers may not want them to have access to their children. particularly their sons, because they may feel, again, as if you being incarcerated, perhaps your father has been incarcerated, like, I want to break this legacy with my son. I don't want him to be exposed to that. I want him to have access to that. And then you have mothers who may have moved on. They may be dating other people. They may have gotten married since their co-parent was incarcerated. And so they may feel like, we don't even want you connected to this family. This child has been adopted by this other person. And I think a lot of times when fathers lose their rights while they're incarcerated and then don't have the capacity to be able to get them back. And so it makes them feel very powerless, like there's nothing they could do, that they're trying to create these relationships, but they're being blocked. It might be by the mom, it might be the extended family who was raising the child. And oftentimes, we're dealing with situations where, particularly if the relationship didn't end very well, or if there was significant financial strain as a result of this father being incarcerated, like people just want to cut their losses and not deal with them. And a lot of times, incarcerated fathers feel like their children have been turned against them. And so when they do try to re enter, they are being blocked because their kids are not interested in having a relationship with them. And for some of them, again, if you went in when your child was a baby, you're out, your child is a teenager, like they've had all of this time to grow and develop without you. There may be a lot of resentment that kids experience with their parents. They feel abandoned. And often, trying to navigate the narrative of who this person really is that's been incarcerated can be really difficult for children. So let's talk a little bit about some of the strategies. There are some really good resources out here. I am not going to be able to go through everything, but I do want to at least give you those resources. Youth.gov has resources for children who have an incarcerated parent. They have a lot of things on there with regard to preparing your child for when their parent is going into the system, preparing your child for when they're about to exit out, preparing your child for visits when they have a parent who is incarcerated. They have resources about how to change a child support order, right? Because we've talked about how difficult that could be for parents trying to pay this amount of money that's just not realistic based on the kind of wages they're able to receive, particularly when they first come into reentry. There's a realistic child support orders. So in state, they break it down from state to state, so you can kind of know, like, okay, what that look like for me. There's a resource called Jobs Not Jail, which will allow you to be able to find what places are hiring people who were formerly incarcerated, and being able to identify the resources. Because if we talk about being able to address the whole family, so the parents and the child, we know that the economic component is a very important one. So, how are we going to be able to sustain? How are we going to be able to take care of our children as we're working to be able to reconnect with them? And then access to justice innovations. And so we do understand, of course, that people are wrongfully convicted, and we do understand that it can be very challenging for people to get certain rights back that they lost once they were incarcerated. And so there are organizations that will assist with the guidance of that, being able to vote again, being able sometimes to have some things removed from your record, expunged. So those are the organizations that are under that access to justice innovations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Sesame Street has a Sesame Street Workshop Initiative, Little Children, Big Challenges, Incarceration, which actually, and they have English and Spanish resources for families with young children who are 3 to 8 who have incarcerated parents. So those are some good things I wanted to drop. So let me just kind of highlight a few things from those resources. One, we need to understand that people are humans and we need to see them as human. So we don't need to see you as incarcerated person who went to jail, person who was arrested, person who got into trouble, person who has made mistakes, right? And see you person as an individual with a variety of needs. And so it's important to be able to identify what those needs may look like. And that, of course, is going to involve a plan, right? So we have to have that reentry plan when we're and you have an incarcerated parent who's about to get out. And the recommendation is about talking to kids around 6 months, trying to do that reconnection around 6 months before the person is released, so you can start kind of building and working toward what those needs are. And that is going to include parental support as well as economic support. And so that might be housing, that might be being able to receive some food benefits, right? You first get out, you don't have resources. Where are you going to live? And not everyone is in a position to be able to go and stay with a relative, because sometimes people have been cut off, or maybe they didn't have a large support system before they went in, or their support system before they went in might be people who are not necessarily healthy for them to be around, right? And so that's all a part of that plan. Being able for parents to address their guilt and their shame and the stigma. That they deal with regard to have been incarcerated, their own issues of abandonment, being abandoned by people when they were incarcerated. A lot of people will say they're going to keep in touch, but their life goes on outside of you, and there's not contact. And so I think a lot of people feel as if they were just kind of cast away and thrown out. So while they're incarcerated, and so particularly if there haven't been any visits, any pictures, any updates about kids, any connection at all, and so it may literally feel as if you're kind of out here by yourself. I think it's very important for um, us to really understand that parents want to be able to be caregivers. They care about their children's well being, they care about their children's education, they care about their children's economic well being. And so it's really important for pre and post release to be able to work on that for parents while parents are incarcerated. And it is important to understand the rules of the facility. Every facility is different, but they all have rules. A lot of parents will say they don't like the rules because that may include them not being able to hold their children, hug their children, sit their children in their laps. And so it may be very difficult to see a child that you love and care about who you haven't seen, and then not be able to access them. And we talk a lot about being able to navigate through that, because not all people who are incarcerated are going to have access to a mental health provider to be able to kind of work through those things. And so, kind of having these conversations prior to about being able to manage those emotions in healthy ways, and being able to make the most of that time while they're there. Like, hey, we can play games together. Like, so we figure out what we can do, instead of focusing on what we can't do. And we definitely want to prep the children, because they're going to have questions. Why can't I hug daddy? Why can't I hug mama? Why can't I, sit in their lap? Or, I don't know them, because maybe I was a baby, literally a baby before. So I haven't really gotten a chance to be able to engage with them, and so they're a stranger to me. And so being able to talk to parents about feeling rejected by their children, who may, like, I am over here, I want to hang out with grandma, I want to stay over here with auntie or uncle, like, I don't know you, strange person. Or if they were in foster care, their foster parents, and being able to navigate that challenge with regard to how the kids may respond differently to these foster parents, and feeling that resentment, like, I'm their parent, like, why are they listening to you and not me? Why do they want to spend time with you and not me? And being able to work through that can be really tough. And so, in as much as there are resources in the facility for parents to utilize, of course, that's important. But if not, definitely upon release, being able to connect with providers to be able to address that. And of course, working with those free and low cost mental health services to be able to address those issues. But also that parenting plan, because we may have to do reunification. You may not even be able to have access to your children when you first are released. And so being able to work through those steps. And I think a lot of times parents are really resentful about having to show that they're fit. But we talk to parents about, like, that's part of that journey, to be able to reconnect, is to follow these steps and follow these rules. And I think that's a frustrating part for people, is they feel like, I'm released now and I'm still having to navigate all these challenges that seem like they're really interfering with me being able to live. And so understandably frustrating. And so being able to have that support system is really important. And that might be through a social support group, that might be through a peer support group, that might be extended family members. You may be fortunate enough to have family. But being able to kind of navigate those things pre-release, I think, is important so people can have hope and understand and not be as frustrated. It is frustrating, but maybe being able to manage it a little better by understanding what the steps are and what the process is, and knowing that they're working toward and seeing some productivity with regard to those goals. Um, I think for children as well, who, right, so your parent may be coming back into a home. So you might have been with grandma while your parent was incarcerated, and so now your parent is coming back into the home. And so being able to really help kids with that readjustment process of, okay, I don't really know this person. They've been gone for a considerable amount of time. Or because my mother was pregnant and she had me when she was incarcerated, like we haven't even been able to bond. And so being able to talk to kids about like what that's going to look like and how difficult it can be for sometimes emotionally, and moms have a lot of guilt about this. It's like I didn't get a chance to bond with you, and so there it feels kind of awkward. It doesn't even feel like you're my child. It feels like you're my mom's child or my sister's child. And so being able, even for the parent, to be able to figure out how to connect with the child, and so that's a process, and being able to understand that. Or dads who, were incarcerated when their children were born, they haven't seen their children haven't seen them, and so they're literally strangers to each other. And being able to navigate that and talk with their children about, okay, like, so maybe we need to first figure out what the kids like. So playing games or movies or activities as we're working through being able to establish that relationship, and having that patience, and giving that grace that that is going to be a journey, because it takes time to be able to have a relationship. And so being able to understand that it's not going to be overnight, but it doesn't mean that you can't have a loving relationship with your child, or that as a parent you can't be loved by your child, but that we just want to make sure that we're taking that time. And again, that's where that family counseling could be really important. And I do understand that some people are coming out, and like a lot of decisions have been made. You may be in at risk of losing your children or losing your parental rights to your children because things took place while you were incarcerated, and that can be very frustrating and very difficult. And so, working with foster care agencies to be able to determine what those stages are, to be able to get your family back together. There is a reunification guide that I think can be really helpful for parents who are in that situation. And I definitely think that emotionally, like, everybody is going to need to be able to have support in different ways. And so ensuring that regardless of what the process is, we're determining what's best for the children, what's best for the parent, because you may come out and there may be still those issues of substance abuse that weren't dealt with while you were incarcerated. There may still be the mental health challenges that weren't dealt with while you're incarcerated. And so having to think too about your own wellness and what's important and what's the priority. It may be my desire to immediately see my children, but am I in a position to be able to do that right now in a way that's going to be helpful for them, right? Because we also want to make sure that everybody is emotionally well before we talk about reunification and connection. So there's a lot of different, I think, aspects too of being on parole, and being able to navigate those challenges, having a structured plan with regard to reentry. Some facilities have their own reentry tips and sheets and materials and resources available, and so taking advantage of them, but also making sure that there are family sessions prior to that release, and ensuring that there is somebody to kind of help with that reentry plan, and that may be through a different agency as well. And so that's why kind of knowing about what resources are out there, and particularly if you have people who are supportive, who can do some of that legwork for you, so that you know some of the things that you need to do when you get out, who you need to connect with, because they've already kind of made some of that initial contact to help, so it doesn't feel like it's just so much that is going on, because there are a lot of things that you are required to take care of when you are released. And so this could feel like, okay, like so many things, what do I prioritize? And so taking the time to get that entry plan prior to you being released can be really helpful to try to navigate and prioritize what are the things that I want to address. Here are the resources that I can connect with while I'm still incarcerated before I get, my pre-release. But also here are some of the things that I can connect with afterwards. Getting the basic needs met and being able to establish housing and all of those things may, of course, not come right away. So being able to figure out, okay, what am I going to do short term versus what am I doing long term? But I do want you all to be aware that there is absolutely opportunities to be able to re-engage and reconnect with your children and as families when you are released from being incarcerated, but that we see you. We recognize that you have value and importance. We also understand that all of us has the potential to make mistakes, and we know that you are doing your best to try to recover from that and continue to give your kids what they deserve. And we appreciate you, and your children need you. So be well.